Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and I'm going to kind of get back to my magazine series, reviewing magazines, but I'm doing a little different. What I decided I wanted to do is go back to the very beginnings and read through some of those earliest magazines, because much of what we are interested in here at Telltale is keeping alive the history of the literature and keeping alive the great works that have been done in the past, many of which are public domain, and many of, I believe all of what's in this magazine are now public domain, because the cutoff the cutoff starting in January is 1929. Everything after 1929 may still have a copyright. 1929 and earlier is all going to be public domain. So I'm going back to not the first issue of Amazing Stories, because that was in 1926. Before that, in 1923, March of 1923, was the first issue of Weird Tales. And the reason to go back all the way to Weird Tales is because a lot of the authors that I talk about either got their start or did significant amounts of publishing in Weird Tales magazine. Authors like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Edmund Hamilton got his start there. Henry Kuttner got his start there. C.L. Moore got her start in Weird Tales. There's just a rich history of excellent, excellent authors of imaginative fiction being published first in Weird Tales or publishing a significant amount of work in Weird Tales. And a lot of those authors are on my list of bibliographies, which means they're authors that I'm interested in looking into at least to a certain extent. And many of them I'm already going through everything they've ever written, like Lovecraft and Kuttner and C.L. Moore. Edmund Hamilton's on that list. Clark Ashton Smith is on that list. So I'm very interested in the um, the very beginnings of the magazine that really launched what became a number of genres: science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And so in March 1923, the first issue of Weird Tales was put on the newsstands. And it was a fairly packed issue. It was 180 some pages. That issue didn't have many authors that would be familiar today. I think the one exception would be Otis Adelbert Klein, although even him today, most people I'm sure have forgotten. Otis Adelbert Klein was a fairly notable Edgar Rice Burroughs imitator, writing a lot of stories about a Mars similar to Barsoom from Burroughs. And his books were still in print in the 1960s by the major science fiction fantasy publishers. And now, of course, everything's available as ebooks. Anyway, I'm going to go through story by story and give you my impressions. A, a note to begin with, though. I do not have a physical copy of the first issue of Weird Tales. Actual copies of that first issue, even in bad condition, sell for ridiculous amounts of money because it's the first issue of Weird Tales magazine. So that's not something I could afford. And I don't have any plans of ever trying to buy a first issue of Weird Tales unless money starts falling from the sky. There are a number of facsimile reproductions of Weird Tales, most notably Girasol Collectibles. Um, it's been a few years now, but they did a line of, I believe, all of the issues of the original run of Weird Tales in facsimile reproduction. But even those, I've seen them selling for $100 a piece, and those are just facsimile reproductions. So kind of pricey to get a hold of copies of Weird Tales. Some of the other more recent pulp magazine um, reprinters like Pulp Tales Press, they have been doing some issues of Weird Tales. They haven't done a lot. Those publishers, I don't believe they publish anything that's not completely public domain. So any issues that still have some copyrighted material in, they won't touch. They only reproduce the issues that they can get complete rights to, without paying a whole lot of money. And because they're not going to sell a lot of copies, let's face it. It's kind of a specialized market for those old magazines. But they have done some copies of Weird Tales. So you can get a hold of them. And they sell them um, at a very reasonable price. I think like $14.95 or something like that. It so you can get reproductions. And I know one of them has the first issue of Weird Tales available for sale online. They're print on demand, so it's going to take a little while because once you order it, they have to go and print it and then ship it to you. So it's going to take a couple weeks. Anyway, I don't have a copy of that first issue. I read a PDF that I found online. Okay. So the very first story in the very first issue of Weird Tales is by an author named Willard E. Hawkins. Now, he turns up again later on in science fiction. He has a story called The Dwindling Sphere, which was published in The Great Science Fiction Stories, Volume 1, edited by Isaac Asimov and Martin Greenberg. And I've read that story, and it's a pretty good story. But first story in the first issue of Weird Tales is by Willard E. Hawkins. It's a short story titled The Dead Man's Tale. And in it, you have a man who is on a battlefield and he dies on the battlefield, but he's still there as a ghost. And he's hoping somehow to connect with the woman he loves. But his best friend marries her because his best friend's still alive and he's not. It's an There's more to the story that I won't go into details because this is a really good story. I would recommend, even if you don't read the entire issue of Weird Tales, I would recommend tracking this one story down or this and a couple other stories, tracking them down and reading them because they are good stories. And this one, it's a very interesting psychological study of revenge, madness, hell, and ultimately redemption of the mind of the main character. I'm not going to say more about it than that. Go and find it and read it. It's a terrific story. I really loved it. The second story, which actually, this one I think deserves top tale status. I've already listed it as a top tale on our list, and that's by Anthony M. Rood. It's a novelette titled Ooze, and it is the cover story. If you've ever seen the cover of this issue, you see an illustration. It says Ooze. And this is just an amazing story. And in it, you have a scientist attempting to grow extra large food sources, kind of like food of the gods type things, by manipulating chromosomes. But it doesn't quite work out as he planned. But when the scientist dies, his son doesn't destroy the results, he keeps them in the house. This story is notably one of Lovecraft's favorite horror stories. And it reminds me in many ways of the Dunwich Horror by Lovecraft, which he wrote after Ooze was published. It, there's a lot about this story that is going to remind you of Lovecraft if you like Lovecraft's work. Um, you have a lot of the same elements. You have a giant monster, you have a broken house in a rural area, you have a family with a strange, weird secret. Um, you just don't have Cthulhu. It's a bit more science fictional than what Lovecraft would have done because the monster comes from the doctor's experiments. And a lot of the early science fiction stories that were published in Amazing and Wonder Stories and Astounding Stories of Super Science in the early days of science fiction magazines owe a lot to this story. A lot of them feel like they are influenced by this particular story. I don't know that that's true, but it sure seems that way. And Root himself was clearly influenced by Verne and Wells and maybe Edgar Allan Poe. So it's really one of the best early pulp stories that I've ever read. It's an excellent story, and I do recommend tracking that one down and reading it. Next came The Thing of a Thousand Shapes, Part 1. It's a serial. It's a story by Otis Adelbert Klein. And I read both parts. Part 2 is in the next issue, and I will get into the next issue of Weird Tales. I intend to try to just read all of them I can possibly get some kind of copy of Weird Tales and Amazing and Astounding and Wonder Stories and all that stuff. Try and go through all these old magazines because there's some good stuff in these that is being forgotten, being lost, being neglected, but it's excellent work like Ooze. Ooze needs to be preserved. We need to remember that story and save it for the future. It's an excellent story. The Thing of a Thousand Shapes it was a good story, but not great. It's I can't remember if it's Otis Adelbert Klein's first story or if it's one of his first, but it's very early in his career. And um, my simple synopsis that I noted here: after Uncle Jim dies, handling his burial and estate becomes scary. It's a fun little horror story, but nothing more than that. It's pretty simple, not totally well plotted. I guess I would only recommend it if you're a diehard Weird Tales fan or diehard Otis Adelbert Klein. Otherwise, I would not worry about that one. Next, The Mystery of Black Jean or Black John. It's a short story by Julian Killman. Black John and his two trained bears live in Canada, and the bears help him in his work. He's kind of really well trained. Black Jean gets into a fight with one of the bears. Later, he crosses two women, and then one gets a gun, and Jean is not seen again. Uh, this wasn't a very good story. this was pulp crap. I would skip that one. Then comes The Grave, a short story by Orville R. Emerson, and a lot of these other, aside from I mentioned Willard Hawkins and Anthony Rood and Otis Adelbert Klein. They went on to do more, especially Otis Adelbert Klein. And there are a couple others in here that are notable in the history of science fiction and horror. The rest of them, in many cases, they only wrote the one story or a couple more stories and then they've disappeared. Orville R. Emerson is one of those. The Grave. In World War I, a German soldier is trapped in his dugout during heavy shelling. It's a pretty good story and has a twist ending. I won't say more than that. I need to move through these quicker. Next is Hark, the Rattle, a short story by Joel Townsley Rogers. Now, that name, for some reason, I know that name. I think he might have written a lot of stuff outside the science fiction genre because that name is ringing a bell with me, but I can't quite remember. But he wrote a little bit of horror stories, and in this one, a man bites dancers with snake fangs and venom. And the story is kind of odd, but it's okay. After that, The Ghost Guard, a short story by Brian Irvine. A prison guard is killed by an inmate, but he had always vowed he would come back. The guard would come back. It's a ghost story, a haunted prison, and there's kind of a prison theme in this issue a little bit. But it's just kind of a standard ghost story. But it's well done and suspenseful. It's a good ghost story, but not going to surprise you at all. Then there's The Ghoul and the Corpse, a short story by G.A. Wells. This one you have a gold prospect in the Arctic, and he finds a strange man frozen in a glacier. This one is more of a science fiction story because, of course, he's finding an ape man or Neanderthal man, something like that. But it's been frozen, so it's perfectly preserved. And it was a simple story, but pretty well written. Then Fear, a short story by David R. Solomon. After being bitten by a moccasin, another snake story. After being bitten by a moccasin, a man is deathly afraid of snakes. Not much of a story. Really not much of a story. After that, The Chain, a short story by Hamilton Craigie. Now, Hamilton Craigie would come back a few times and publish in Weird Tales. In The Chain, a crook has some papers that someone else tries to get from him. He's got them locked up in a safe. Somebody is after him to try and get the papers. I won't go farther than that. It's really more of a crime mystery story, kind of more. I don't know what magazines, more the sort of thing the hard-boiled detective writers would do than a weird tale. And it wasn't that great of a story either. Then comes A Place of Madness, a short story by Merlin Moore Taylor. And this is another prison story. A solitary cell in a prison is known for driving inmates mad with only a short time there, like 2 hours, and these people just go completely insane. So this doctor says, nonsense, I can stay in that for 2 hours and not go insane. I'll come out perfectly fine. And of course, right then and there what's going to happen, and it does. So predictable ending, but the writing of getting there, because you go into the cell with the doctor and the story is then told from his viewpoint in that cell as he goes mad, and not perfectly done, not brilliantly done, but pretty good, pretty convincing. I'd say A for effort on that story. It's not bad, and might be worth looking up and reading it. Then comes The Closing Hand. This one was written by Farnsworth Wright. And if that name rings a bell with you, it's because Farnsworth Wright would later become the editor of Weird Tales magazine. And he would champion the likes of H.P. Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, C.L. Moore, Henry Cudner, etc., etc. And in the March 1923 issue, he's publishing a short story. And in his story, it's a really short story. It's really more like flash fiction. In the short story of The Closing Hand, two young girls are left alone in an abandoned and supposedly haunted house. Pretty well done, kind of predictable. It's your predictable ghost story. Then comes The Unknown Beast, the short story by Howard Ellis Davis. A beast is killing people and livestock in the swamps. This one, it didn't feel finished. It wasn't, you didn't get any kind of closure. And you really didn't, I mean, it's not like I was looking for somebody to capture and kill the beast, but um, you really didn't get any sense of there even really being a beast, except things are dying. It was just kind of a bad story. Then comes The Basket, a short story by Herbert J. Mangum, in which you have a strange man renting an apartment. I just put a note here that it's an odd story with an odd ending. Not much happens and nothing is explained. It's one that I was just really confused with what the heck was going on and why anybody would want to read this. After that, The Accusing Voice, a novelette by Meredith Davis. In this one, a man hears a voice taunting him and driving him to madness. This reminded me a lot of The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. But there's a twist to it, and it's pretty good. It's not a great story, but this one's worth your time looking it up and reading it. The Accusing Voice. And right after that, the sequel. And the reason it's called the sequel, it's a short story by Walter Scott Story. What he does is he writes a different conclusion to Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. And that's why it's a sequel. It was an okay story, but it would have been stronger if it would have felt more like The Cask of Amontillado, if you would have tried to bring in more of the style of Edgar Allan Poe, because that's a lot of what makes Edgar Allan Poe compelling. He didn't do that though, so it falls short, but it was okay. After that, The Weaving Shadows, a short story by W.H. Holmes. A detective investigates the strange claims of a man living with his sister and his niece. This was a different kind of story. It was very effective, very enjoyable. But I left the story trying to figure out and not really succeeding whether or not we were dealing with ghosts or vampires. But the description and the imagination here are really good. This is an excellent Weird Tales story. After that comes Nimba, the Cave Girl by R.T.M. Scott, a short story. And it's just about the life of a cave girl. It's about a couple days in her life dealing with the cavemen trying to come after her and mate with her. Kind of well written, but very dated and a little bit sexist. So I would skip that one really. The Young Man Who Wanted to Die, which was published in Weird Tales as a short story by question. Didn't say who wrote this. And researching on the Internet Science Speculative Fiction Database doesn't come up with any author connected to this story. Nobody knows who. It's lost to history, I guess. Nobody knows who wrote this story, the young man who wanted to die. But this is a really cool story. It's about a guy who commits suicide, and the rest of the story is his journey through the afterlife, through all different stages of the afterlife. And it's extremely imaginative, kind of cosmic, very weird. It, sort of reminding me of a Clark Ashton Smith or Lovecraft in um, the fantasy stories that he wrote early on. I forget what they call those. That series. They're not Cthulhu stories. Kind of reminded me of that, and I thought it was a really good story, but it suffers from the ending that kind of pulls the rug out from under the whole thing. After that, The Scarlet Knight by William Sanford. Here you have an unfaithful wife and a doctor. They try to murder a guy. Very short, not very well plotted, and I just didn't buy what was happening. Not very well written. Next one, The Extraordinary Experiment of Dr. Calgroni, a short story by Joseph Faust and James Bennett Wooding. And here you have a strange doctor who takes up residence in an abandoned house in a small town. It wasn't that good. It's predictable, and it's like watching a 1940s Universal horror film, Son of Frankenstein or something like that. Kind of cliche. The next one, The Return of Paul Slavsky, and you see what I mean. There's a lot of fiction in this. They're mostly very, very short stories, but there's just so much. And this was the first issue. Where did they get all these writers submitting stories when they had never even been in print before? They must have sent out a call to all the writing agencies. Anyway, the next story, The Return of Paul Slavsky, short story by George Warburton Lewis. And this one, you have terrorists being transported on a train. One of them says her dead brother is going to come and get revenge. I found it a confusing story, one in which I couldn't really keep very well track of who's on first and what's going on. I didn't think it was a very good story. The House of Death is a short story by F. Georgia Stroup. Stroup, not sure. In this one, working women find a letter relating to a woman suspected of killing her baby. Not a very good story. After that comes The Gallows, a short story by I.W.D. Peters. And that one, a man is going to be hung for murdering her wife's lover. And then it goes into what happened. Not a very interesting one. The Skull is a short story by Harold Ward. Now, Harold Ward will appear a number of times in the future of Weird Tales. In this one, a man kills another man with an arrow that he got from the local natives, and he assumed the arrow was poisoned. He tested it out by shooting his partner, and his partner instantly dies. So, yep, poisoned. Not that good of a story, but also very racist. So I would skip The Skull. Not very good. And then another 8-man story, The 8-Man, is a novelette by James B. M. Clark, where you have this man current day, but he seems to be able to control and communicate with a wide variety of primates, monkeys, apes, whatever. But I didn't find that story very interesting. It kind of suggested where this man was maybe an ape man also, but never really cements that in. Um, didn't think it was a great story. So that is all the stories in the March 1923 issue of Weird Tales. It's historically fascinating. A few of the stories are very interesting, and one of the stories I think is truly excellent. So, at least looking up that one story, Ooze, is worth your time. Just reading Ooze and moving on. The rest of the magazine, I would say, is mainly of interest to those who are interested in this history, interested in where Weird Tales came from. And I mean, Weird Tales, there was horror before Weird Tales, but horror as a genre didn't really come into play until you had Weird Tales. And, a lot of early horror, a lot of early fantasy, a lot of early science fiction was published here before there were any other magazines doing this. There was one other magazine in one of the European countries that was publishing horror fiction in 1919, but that one it only published a few issues and it was kind of forgotten about for a long time and then rediscovered. Weird Tales, of course, made a huge impact. So Weird Tales can be accurately said to have launched genre genre speculative fiction. I say speculative because I want to go beyond just horror, go beyond just science fiction, go beyond just fantasy, and include all of them. Because Weird Tales was including all of them um, at a time when Amazing Stories was still in the 3 years in the future. So Weird Tales really is the place where um, the all the genre fiction got its start as genre. Okay, so um, I'm going to get back to more current magazines. I've got the revival of Galaxy magazine just arrived a couple days ago, and so I've read the introductory editorials. I'm going to start with the first story, which is a David Gerrold story. This the current issue of Galaxy, um, being published by Starship Sloan Publishing, and he's going to keep publishing this. You can't subscribe to it yet, but you can buy individual printed issues. So far, there's only been one issue from them. They do intend to keep going. Uh, so far, it looks really, really good. They've got a story by David Gerrold. They've got a story by Christopher Rucchio. It's looks like a terrific issue, and I'm gonna read that and report on that. And I also just received the latest um, dated summer 2024 issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction. If I have time, I'm going to get into that and read that. Uh, Fantasy and Science Fiction is going down to quarterly publication. I don't think that's a bad move because the magazines, Fantasy and Science Fiction, Analog and Asmos, are now doing double, they have been doing for some time now, these double issues every other month. And it's a lot of fiction. These are big issues. And with all the other reading I'm doing for Telltale, I've been wanting to report on the issues in a timely manner, but that has proven impossible because they're just coming along too fast. With Fantasy and Science Fiction going down to quarterly publication, the reasons for it doing that are not good and don't bode well for the future of the magazine unless they can turn things around. But it's actually kind of good for someone like me that just can't get to them every other month to go down to a quarterly schedule. Maybe I can handle that. And so I've got it. I just received it yesterday. I'm going to try and get to fantasy and science fiction and report on that one. I have also started reading the April 1923 issue of Weird Tales, and I want to report on that. So I'm trying to get back to these magazine videos, but I also want to go way back and talk about the magazines from the past, because a lot of the other videos I'm doing, the stories I'm talking about were published in these magazines. But there's a lot of other things in each of these issues that I'm not talking about. And it does kind of give you a good perspective to look at one issue of a magazine and talk about all the stuff that's in that issue, especially when you go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s, even the 1960s, and you have single issues of a magazine that'll have J.G. Ballard and Mack Reynolds and Robert Silverberg and um, I don't know, maybe Isaac Asimov or Harlan Ellison, all in one issue of the magazine. You got all these, and and that's a situation that really did keep up for a very long time. As long as most of those classic science fiction authors were still alive and writing. And when I first got into these magazines, the first issue of Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction I picked up contained stories by John Kessel, Stephen King, Thomas M. Dish. I mean, mind blowing, and some other really terrific. I believe C.J. Sherry was in there. Mind blowing when you look at the table of contents and see the caliber of authors that were filling that magazine. Unfortunately, you pick up a lot of the magazines today, and there may be a couple of authors that you've heard of, but the rest of them are all unknowns. But for many, many, many years, the science fiction magazines had fiction by all the greatest authors of classic science fiction, fantasy, and horror appearing in the pages. The tables of contents are just incredible. And who knows, maybe the tables of contents of the current science fiction magazines will look that way 20, 30 years from now. But I kind of doubt it, because the major authors today just are not publishing in the magazines. Some of them still are. Like I say, the latest issue of Galaxy with David Gerrold. I mean, he's one of the great science fiction authors from the past, and he's got a brand new story in that issue of Galaxy. But it's kind of the exception, not the rule right now. There aren't very many of the really top-notch authors that are still publishing in these magazines. So in any one issue, you only get one or two of them. And these are issues they're bi-monthly, so they're made to be like double issues. And they still are not bringing in the top talent, which is unfortunate. It would be nice to see more of the top authors going back to the magazines and doing some short works for the magazines, or serialized novels like they used to. It would be cool to see that again, and support these science fiction, fantasy, and horror magazines that I've always loved, and support the revivals. I mean, Starship Sloan brought back not just Galaxy; they also brought back If. And by the way, both the first issues of those magazines published this year, they're both available for free online as a PDF. So you go to website, you can download both of those magazines for free, which is cool. So, have you ever read the first issue of Weird Tales, or at least the story Ooze, or any of these other stories? Leave your comments. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about my format here and what I'm doing. I'm hopefully what I hope to achieve is first of all pick out the gems that are hidden in these old magazines and the gems that are in the new magazines. But second of all, help you to decide if it's worth your while to bother with it. Um, maybe the magazines aren't for you. Maybe they are for you. Maybe I'll get you excited about it. The unfortunate thing of any magazine is you're not going to have 100% of the content be really terrific through the entire magazine. It's going to be kind of hit and miss. There'll be, like this issue, one story that's actually a top tale, 3, 4 stories that are interesting and worth reading, and the rest of them I would pass. But they're of historical interest. So I hope I'm helping you to decide if it's worth looking this stuff up, and uh, try to steer you to the ones that may be um, the most interesting in looking up of all these stories. So I'm going to leave you with that. Leave your comments, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Come on back. I'm going to be doing probably the latest issue of Galaxy Science Fiction will be my next magazine review. And I hope you'll join me.